Hi guys, I'm Sarah, and welcome to episode 1 of the Barn Quilt Project, the series where I recreate quilt blocks that I see on barns. I've actually never quilted before, aside from sewing basic squares together, so this is going to be a learning process. That being said, I've decided to start with an easy classic quilt design, the Ohio Star. I found this block in the town of Everett on the side of Bailey's Potato Farm. It's only 2 colors and a basic layout, so when I first saw it, I immediately thought it would be a great way to start this quilting journey. I decided to start by drawing out my design. Although this block I'm starting with is quite basic, I figured as things progress, it would be good to have a reference page on hand, as well as something I can look back on as I continue this project. The Ohio Star is a 9-block quilt design, believed to have been developed in the early 1800s in America. Whether the block was originally developed in Ohio, as the name would suggest, is unknown, as the block itself appears to predate the coining of the Ohio Star name. 5 of the 9 blocks, in the corners and the center, are solid plain squares, which are checkerboarded with quarter square triangles, which form the points of the star. Throughout this project, I'm making it a goal of mine to use primarily scrap and repurposed fabrics to make my blocks. So I dove into my stash, and I found a solid gray bed skirt, which I thought would be nice, as well as 2 pattern options for the red. And although I did like the red and white check, and it was already conveniently cut into 6-inch squares, I decided that the red leaves I pulled from my grandmother's scrap fabric pile complemented the gray a little bit better. Now, I did not realize how difficult it was to cut squares out of fabric that were actually square until I started this, and I immediately failed, and I had to turn to YouTube to find a tutorial on how to properly use my cutting mat. So I will leave a link to that tutorial that I used down below, because it certainly saved me a lot of frustration and wasted fabric. One thing I do wish I had done differently for this though, is to use a different mat, because this only has a 1-inch grid, and the squares I needed for the corners and the center were 4.5 inches, so I had to draw a 1/2-inch mark on the mat in order to cut those to the proper size. So after I finished filming this, I looked closer at some of the other mats in the sewing room, and I was able to find a different mat with a better grid, so the next block should hopefully be a little bit easier to cut out. I started sewing the quarter square triangles by taking 2 6-inch squares of red and 2 6-inch squares of the gray, and pairing a gray with a red and pinning them right sides together. I drew a diagonal line up the middle of each pair to use as a guide, and then sewed about a 1/4 inch away from the line on either side to create 2 half-square triangles from each pair of squares. I say about a 1/4 inch because my sewing machine doesn't have a guideline at a 1/4 inch, and the foot is slightly larger than a 1/4 inch on either side, so I just did my best, but I should probably just stick a piece of tape on the machine to use as a guide so that my seam allowances are more accurate. You'll see later in the video why this may have been an issue. Anyways, once the sewing was done, I cut along the center lines and pressed the half-square triangles open, pressing the seam towards the red side, so hopefully the seams will nest when they're sewn together. This iron I'm using is actually my mom's Christmas gift from my dad, because her old one broke. But we didn't have another iron in the house, and you can't really quilt without one, so I may have borrowed it just to test it out for her. Once the squares were all pressed and crisp, I once again pinned 2 squares right sides together. And when I do this, I always flip up one side to double check that the colors are placed in the correct orientation, because I absolutely hate having to unpick seams, and the fabric never lays as nice once you've messed with it, and I'd rather just do everything I can to avoid having to unpick. These squares were sewed together diagonally, just the same as the last step, a 1/4 inch from the middle on either side to create 2 1/4 square triangles from each pair of half square triangles. My 1/4 square triangles didn't end up looking anywhere near perfect. The triangles were slightly uneven and slightly off kilter, but for a first attempt, I'm not going to beat myself up over that. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this whole project is going to be a learning process, and I can't expect everything I do to be perfect on my first attempt. If you guys see something you think I can improve on or have any tips for me, please comment them down below because I would love to learn from your advice so that each block I sew ends up better than the last. I pressed my 1/4 square triangles open, pressing the seam to whichever side it naturally seemed to want to fall, and then I took them over to the cutting mat because they all ended up larger than I wanted them to be, which I'm choosing to look at as a good thing, because I would definitely prefer to trim off the excess rather than start over because they ended up too small. And I needed to square them up anyway, so taking a little extra off the sides wasn't a big deal. So I trimmed each 1/4 square triangle down to 4.5 inches to match the size of the squares I already cut for the corners and the center. This step was also super satisfying because I finally had all 9 of my blocks ready and the same size, and I was able to lay out all of my squares and really visualize the finished product for the first time. I lined the squares up like a puzzle and played with the placement of the squares a little bit to try to get the grain of the fabric all going in the same direction. I decided to sew the rows together first. So I pinned them each together, again, double checking that placement just in case. Although, since it's a symmetrical block, I guess these could also be the columns. Doesn't really matter. Anyways, I sewed each row together, trying to keep the squares lined up as best as I could. And once they were all assembled, I brought them over to the ironing board to press those seams. I pressed the seams for the top and bottom rows towards the outer edge, and the seams for the middle row towards the middle. Basically, I just pressed the seam away from the 1/4 square triangles. Again, I am doing this in the hopes that the seams will nest together nicely in the next steps. Then it is on to the final sewing step, and I pinned all the rows together, trying really hard to get all the corners to line up. But unfortunately, because my 1/4 square triangles were off, they didn't all meet like they should. The next block I have planned is a variation on the Ohio Star, so maybe that'll give me a chance to try again and redeem myself. Stay tuned and subscribe if that's something you'd like to see. I sewed these rows together, and once all of the sewing was done, I was able to get my first look at my fully sewed up block. And I'm not mad at it. I actually think it looks pretty good, and the colors work well together. So I gave it its final press to get all the seams laying flat and ready for its final trim. Now, the plan was for this block to end up being 12.5 inches when it was finished, so that if I chose to sew it into a quilt, its finished size would be an even 12 inches. But since my seam allowances were not exact, it did not end up being that big. So I had to trim it down to 12 inches instead. But that's alright, it's still cute, and it's only 1/2 inch. And that brings us to the end of episode 1 of our barn quilt project. I hope you guys enjoyed and follow along on this quilting adventure. Happy quilting!